The next one up on this list, we return to Psygnosis and tackle their second North American game released for the system, and that's game number 24, Destruction Derby. Based on a real sport of Demolition Derby, and the first one in North America to use the PlayStation Link cable. Published by Psygnosis and developed by Reflections. You compete in a demolition championship called Destruction Derby, hint the title, where you have to compete in several championships that involved wrecking cars for points and mostly competing in first place in races if optional. You only have 3 cars to choose from, with each having their own differences in attributions, which they're named after difficulties, which are Rookie Psygnosis, Amateur Grim Reaper, and Pro Smoothie, which I swear feels like they just pulled out random words out of a box to fit those names together, and even hearing those names is just 8 bits laughable. Back to topic, after choosing one of the 3 cars you chose, you go to the championship, which the formula goes: win 5 races and also wrecking cars, which the courses are Speedway, Crossover, Ocean Drive, Cactus Creek, and City Heat. And after that, wreck all the cars in the bowl, where the derby takes place for the final part. In total, you have to win the championship 5 times in order to beat the game, with some different elements so it won't get repetitive, like switching up the courses, changing the time of day, or reversing the courses. Can you beat the championship 5 times in a row and become the champion of Destruction Derby? Before we start on the game's history and review, let me give you a little bit of an info and how it started. Demolition Derby is a motor event which its origins are unknown, but many people speculate that it started in the 1930s with somebody utilizing the abundant supply of a worn-out Ford Model TS, or if it started in 1947 at the Corral Speedway, since one source says that Don Basile is the one who invented the Demolition Derby, but to most people, it actually began in 1958 when a stock car racer, Larry Mendelson, created the concept for demolition derbies at New York State's Islip Speedway in 1958, after realizing that many people favored wrecks to racing, and it grew in popularity once the 1960s came, with the first ever demolition derby to take place at the Raleigh Park Speedway in Adelaide, which is in Australia, in 1963. The rules for the sport is to wreck, smash, and ram their vehicle to another opponent's vehicle until their vehicle gets totally destroyed. With each event consists of 5 or more drivers competing in the derby. The one who is the last remaining driver that is still operational is awarded the victor and champion of the derby. Though many people consider it too violent due to this type of sports genre being dangerous and can cause serious injuries to most of the drivers, it was still popular in most of the United States and other Western nations, thanks to a television network, ABC, televising the World Championship Demolition Derby in their formal program block, ABC's Wide World of Sports, which aired from the mid-60s all the way up to the early 90s. The sport is still around till this very day, which is basically part of an American tradition to some parts of the United States. Naturally, with a sport being so popular, there were many related things that were involved with the sport, like more cable networks like CBS televising the sport in the Nashville network block, which was required in 1997, a sitcom that has a female professional demolition driver named Pinky Tascadero from ABC's sitcom Happy Days, a folk pop song called Rapid Roy, the Stock Car Boy, sung and wrote by Jim Croce in his 1972 album You Don't Mess Around with Jim, and of course the obvious video games. The first one that was based on the sport is 1975's Destruction Derby, not to be confused with the 1995 game that I'm going to talk about a few minutes later. Released in the arcades by the publisher Chicago Coin and developer Exidy, which they're probably known for their most controversial arcade game, Death Race. After that, several more games based on Demolition Derby were made, like Demolition Derby in 1984 by Bally Midway, Auxiliary Powers Demolition Derby and Figure 8 Race in 2001 by Auxiliary Power, Test Drive Eve of Destruction in 2004 by Atari, Destruction All-Stars in 2021, which came out just recently, by Sony Interactive Entertainment. Heck, even SpongeBob took a jab at the concept of Demolition Derby with SpongeBob's Boating Bash in 2010 by THQ. But the one that is the most memorable game that have the Demolition Derby concept, and the one I'm going to be talking about, is Destruction Derby, which our development history begins. It all started at a British development studio called Reflections Interactive, which was created back in 1984 by two founders of the company, Martin Edmondson and Nicholas Chamberlain. Their first few games were published by Superior Software, with Reflections' debuted game, Raven Skull, released in 1986, both for Acorn Electron and BBC Micro, and then a year later they made two more, which are codenamed Droid and Striker's Run in 1987. Unfortunately, Reflections' publisher, Superior Software, didn't last long, and ultimately abandoned the development studio somewhere in 1987 or 1988. Now with the development company having no publisher to release their game, where would they find a new publisher to release their games at? Enter Psygnosis, a publisher trying to find some development studios until they stumbled across Reflections, who were finding a publisher, which Psygnosis made an agreement with Reflections at the right time in late 1988. For the next 5 years, roughly from 1989 to 1994, they were making games with the new publisher, Psygnosis, and released games by Reflections like Ballistic, Awesome, Brian the Lion, and the Shadow of the Beast trilogy, for home computers like Amiga and Atari ST. However, somewhere in mid-1994, Reflections was tasked by Psygnosis to make another video game for MS-DOS, but also the first one to be ported to home consoles, which are the Sega Saturn and, you guess it, Sony PlayStation. But the question is, what kind of game should it be? Co-founder Martin Edmondson and Michael Tufton suggested that the next game should be based on Demolition Derby, since both of them are fans of the real-life Demolition Derby sport and even concepted the ideal of the sport. The entire development team agreed on this, and the concept, with one of the founders, Martin Edmondson, as the director of the game, and thus began working on the game in late 1994 for DOS, Saturn, and PlayStation. There were several things the developers were working on, like to make the results of car collisions easier to predict. Reflections implemented simulated physics into Destruction Derby. Edmondson believed that the game would otherwise be completely unplayable, as with pool when the collisions are all off. The producer of the game, Tony Parks, noted that the physics were simplified to improve performance and to compensate for the PlayStation's digital controller, and that the team sought a balance between realism and playability. Performance was also improved by optimizing the game's graphics, and by reducing the level of detail of objects in the distance. Destruction Derby's game engine supports up to 20 cars on screen simultaneously, which no console racing game other than Daytona USA for the arcade and Saturn had achieved until that time. However, a single wired frame model differentiated by texture maps was used for every vehicle. Damage to vehicles is modeled in real time, based on the speed and angle of the cars involved. The team made the game's track small to keep the density of the cars on the track very high, which allowed for large-scale wrecks. And finally, for the PlayStation, they were implementing an upcoming peripheral that could support multiplayer mode by using a cable to link two PlayStation consoles, which makes this the very first US game to support the PlayStation Link Cable peripheral, which I'll talk more on it later in the review. But a few things to say that the peripheral wasn't actually released until a month later in December 95, which was part of the 1995 Christmas shopping season. So they have to wait for a month to get the link cable, and another thing that there were plans to support up to 8 players with the link cable, but did not have time finishing supporting that mode, so it only implemented with only up to 2 players. The game was first shown in May 1995 at the first annual Electronic Entertainment Expo, aka E3 1995, with its initial title, which was a placeholder name as Demolition Derby or Demolition Derby. Writers for Edge and Next Generation had some very high expectations during the expo, and commented that the game could trounce Ridge Racer upon the PlayStation's release. When the game originally came out for MS-DOS in October 1995 in both North America and Europe, it received some generally good reviews, like Lee Buchanan of PC Gamer US praised the spectacular visuals that bring to life the most jarring collisions I've seen on a computer. And he noted that car damage is depicted beautifully. Although he found the game too easy, even at the toughest difficulty level, he found this game to be a minor issue that did not detract from the experience. And Peter Olfsson of Computer Gaming World called the game a great simulation of demolition derbies, and he wrote that the wrecks are conclusive and realistic. However, he found its useful lifespan is surprisingly short, and he hoped for a track editor in its sequel. But then noted that despite its limitations, this is a great game, but it has a lot more potential. So, with the DOS version being a successful hit, how will it do for the home console versions, mainly the Saturn and PlayStation? Well, for the PS1 version, when it was released in Europe in October 20th, 1995, North America in November 16th, 1995, and Japan in February 9th, 1996, it too was a success just like the DOS version. Reviewers and critics had some good things and some bad things to say about the game, like Captain Squidio from GamePro called Destruction Derby the most ruckus racing experience of the fall. He believed that its graphics are almost all you could want for a game of this type, but wrote that nothing here stands out as graphically spectacular, although he complained that the game does not let players customize cars, and he disliked its lack of split-screen multiplayer, but summarized, limited options keep Destruction Derby out of the winner's circuit, but this rowdy stock car racer still generates a stadium full of thrashing fun. Another reviewer from Next Generation was extremely pleased with the concept of smashing into other cars, saying it taps into a nearby universal fantasy, but then remarked that the single-player mode is indefinitely lacking, and the multiplayer offers unqualified enjoyment. And finally, Victor Lucas from the Electric Playground stated that the beauty of the game is the strategy involved in making calculated strikes against enemy vehicles. And he wrote, if you go all out and try to make a big noise on the track, more than likely you'll be limping to the scrapyard in seconds. He also believed that the game's stock car racing mode is no match for the white-knuckled interior of either Wipeout or Ridge Racer, and that the Demolition Derbies in the bowl were most fun to be had in the game. He then praises the game's graphics and physics, and concluded Destruction Derby is a winner in every capacity. After the PlayStation version was released, we then eventually got the Saturn version a year later. However, despite being released in Europe in August 15, 1996, and Japan in September 20th, 1996, the North American version was cancelled, despite being advertised for the game, though that could be the case knowing that the Sega Saturn was struggling in the US market and not so good reviews for the Saturn version as well. So I'm guessing why it never got released here in North America. Anyways, enough talk, let's head on back to the PlayStation version of Destruction Derby and review it, to see if the game aged well and still be remembered as a PS classic. Starting now. The graphics is okay. The car design is decent enough, and so is the skybox, which includes daylight, nighttime, and sunset. But the rest is a bit blocky. Not the worst one compared to the other PlayStation titles from '95, but still, it is noticeable and a bit dated to some parts of the game, like the trees and bushes being 2D pixelated, and the crowd in the bowl, which, yeah, no comment on that. Nothing else to say about the graphics, but meh. Oh wait, I take it back. There's actually one more thing I forgot to mention, is when you finish a race in the tournament, there's a feature called Pit Compound. What does it do exactly? Does it refill your gas? Or fixing your car after a race? Well, what I just said is none of those. All it does is showing your wrecked car from the race and the truck transportation with your or the CPU's logo name on the truck. Man, they are really pushing it by showing off the graphics, are they? Maybe for its time it was great since it was Reflection's first 3D game. But it's nothing spectacular nowadays, and you can't even scroll manually like other or future games later on. It does it automatically. So what is the point to have this at all? It should have just got scrapped later on during development. Anyways, moving on to the next segment. The presentation is alright. You'll have your standard menu, which the layout of it is familiar to Ridge Racer, though it's completely different compared to it. But when you start the game and go to the title screen, it shows you the option if you either play single player mode, which shows one console, or the multiplayer link up mode, which shows two consoles with the link cable attached. But we'll discuss about it later on in the gameplay segment. There are a few modes, like Wreckin' Racing, which are Championship, Race Practice, Multiplayer, and Duel, Stock Car Racing, which is a normal race, Destruction Derby, which you wreck cars in the bowl, and Time Trials, which is just time trials obviously. There is also a memory card save feature to save a game, the track selection, the car selection, which shows a demonstration of the stock car driving around in circles in the bowl, which at its time was neat to show. And of course, the option manual, like fastest laps, control pad, audio, and sentry screen. If you're wondering why the word is called sentry instead of center, it's because it is the British word of saying center, which they switched the letters E and R at the end of the word. So seeing this in PAL regions is fine, but seeing this outside of Europe and other PAL territories, people may have presumed this to be a typo error. Don't know why they didn't change the word when being slated to release in North America, but we may never know. Finally, the game HUD, which the only two things to say is the race points in the upper left used for racking up points if you wreck or slam to another car, and the car shield in the bottom right used for what parts of the car is damaged or hit. Like for example, if your car slams into the right rear, it turns from green to light green, get hit and damaged more times, then it turns yellow, then orange, then red, and then black once that part of the side is wrecked. We'll come back to this part later on. The music is quite perfect, with the soundtrack consists of electronica and techno music. The main up-tempo tracks are from the hardcore and jungle techno subgenres, composed by the duo Tim Swan and Elliot Summer. This kind of music was highly popular in the 90s in the United Kingdom at the time. Heck, if you even want to listen to this music, both PlayStation and Saturn versions of the game used the compact disc digital audio format, or CDDA for short. So you could listen to all the music tracks on a normal CD player, or just look it up on the internet. But hey, your choice. For my opinions on the soundtrack, it's great, had some sweet vibes, and perfectly used for a club or rave party. Overall, it's just great and kick-ass all around. And finally, the gameplay. The controls are decent enough, with no minor problems to discuss. But the one thing is that whenever one of your parts of your car gets destroyed, it alternately changes the momentum of your car. Like left part destroyed, you can no longer go left. Or right part destroyed, you can no longer go right. Or even your speed could slow down if almost half of your car is destroyed. And if your radar gets destroyed in the front, it's an immediately race over. But luckily, it's not a game over. You see, it's not your typical race to the finish to get first. You actually have to wreck the opponent's car to gain points. Sure, you could still win at first place since it's optional, but that won't do because you still need a lot of points to get first place. If you end up either in second to last place once you finish that tournament, you'll have to replay the tournament again. So make sure to rack up points to reach first place or else. And finally, the one that you have been waiting for, the link cable. So, what does this peripheral do? Well, it's a device that allows for two consoles to be connected to each other in order to play compatible multiplayer games on separate consoles. How does it connect? Well, simple. Just connect it in the serial port and that's it. After that, go to the beginning of the menu screen and press the one with the two consoles that I previously mentioned. And there you go, you're now playing with a friend with each having their own screen to play together. I bet back then it was very cool to see this with your very own eyes and was revolutionary at the time. Too bad it didn't age well and was discontinued in the late 90s. Well, that escalated quickly, but why to be exact? Well, here are a few reasons. First, you have to get two PlayStation consoles, two TV sets, and two exact same game in order to play it with a friend. So let me calculate the price back in 1995. So for the TV set back in the 90s, it was mostly reaching up for $200, so let's make it that. For the console, it was $299 when it was first released. And finally, there's the retail game, which cost $50. So if you add that up in total, it would have cost you $549. But wait, if you times it by 2 with the inclusion of the link cable, which the price was maybe at $39, then the complete total would be $1,137. That is a pain in the ass. All for a setup, and if you even equivalent back in 1995 to present day as of 2021, then the total would be $1,962.25. You could buy a rent apartment or a used car for that price. Second, the peripheral didn't last long in the market. Sony thought this peripheral was going to be the next step into gaming and wanting to utilize it for a lot of games. But out of the 1,284 titles released in North America, only 45 games were compatible with the link cable, along with the other 9 games that weren't released in North America, thus with the total amount being 54 games. And finally, it was trying to replicate from the arcades to your home, since most arcade cabinets, mostly racing titles, used 2 screens for each player. While it is impressive that Sony managed to pull this off, but during the mid-90s, arcades were starting to slowly decline, mostly due to the fact when it reached to the 5th generation, they were finally starting to be accurate to their arcade counterparts. So there was no need to leave the house and go to arcades anymore. And obviously, it was a useless feature to begin with. I mean, do you really want to play multiplayer mode by trying to find another TV set, console, and game? Well, no, you wouldn't. And so did the people back then. They found it too expensive, was impractical for most consumers, and by the end of 1997, most retailers were no longer carrying the PlayStation Link cable. Even though it was discontinued, there were still some games that did contain the feature, with the final game supporting it was surprisingly enough RoboPit 2 in 2003. We'll get to that for a very long time. Oh, and one last thing, there is a multiplayer mode in the regular menu, so you may be thinking that it would be just a regular split-screen multiplayer mode. Well, that's a huge lie. All you ever do in this mode is player 1 goes first, and then player 2 goes next, meaning both players can't play at the same time and must take turns. What a huge letdown and a slap in the face. And do you want to know the most ridiculous thing? It can go up to 20 players. Yup, 20 freaking players. Imagine having 19 friends to come over to your house and play the game, but they have to wait one at a time until they get a turn rather than playing all together. So yeah, this mode is completely pointless, and it's just too ridiculous of why it was such a good idea for this mode. Anyways, as for the game itself, well, I don't want to say it's good or it's bad, but it's more on the latter, as in, it's okay. First, the pros. I like that it doesn't repeat the same tracks over and over again for all 5 tournaments and try to do something different, like making some tracks reverse or changing of the track style, or even changing the weather like I said in my previous segment. As for the cons, it gets a bit boring by the time you enter the 3rd or 4th tournament. And I know what I said about the tracks changing its style, but the visual and location remains the same and almost identical at certain places. And last, there's nothing rewarding at the end, aside from getting a bonus track called Ruined Monastery. It's neat, I guess, but not enough to be rewarding. That's all I can say about this segment. And now, the conclusion. The game is an okay start, but a mixed bag. I do like some parts of the game, like the destruction for points, changing up some few tracks, and a kick-ass soundtrack, but there were some flaws like the graphics not being good, especially the trees, unnecessary features and modes, and a lack of replay value. But also the link cable being outdated. But we'll have to mention it in future history/reviews if it's compatible with it, of course. I know this was probably impressive back in 1995, especially that it was, again, Reflection's first 3D game, but playing it now, it really had some very huge bumps, but doesn't go that far from bad, thankfully. So, what happened after that? Well, many years later, the game would be featured as part of the PlayStation Classic in 2018, As for the series itself, it did manage to make a few sequels. Like, the only two games that I will discuss in a future review are Destruction Derby 2 in 1996 and Destruction Derby Raw in 2000. As well as two more games that I won't discuss, like Destruction Derby 64 in 1999, which is its own thing rather than a port to the original MS-DOS version, and Destruction Derby Arenas in 2004, which is the last game in this series and possibly the worst one too. And since 2004, they have never made another one after that. And as for Reflections, they would continue working with Psygnosis and keep making games until they were dropped in 1999. For the early to mid 2000s, Reflections were releasing their games from other publishers, like GT Interactive, Infogrames, and Atari Inc. It was like that for a while, until in 2006, when Ubisoft acquired Reflections to be part of the division, thus changing their names to Ubisoft Reflections, which they're probably best known for the Tom Clancy's The Division series, the Watch Dogs series, and the Just Dance series. So overall, for this game, it may not be remembered and hasn't aged well, but was an okay start for this series, as well as the next big leap for the company. I give my official rating a 3 out of 6. Next time on the PlayStation years, we take another look at a Psygnosis game. This time, it's based loosely on the 8th novel from a formal long-running series of books, written by the deceased Terry Pratchett, and the first North American game for this system to be a point-and-click adventure. What is that game? Well, I'll tell you in the next review. Thanks for watching.